Hey guys, tonight we're starting something very slow, very gentle, and honestly, very boring in the best possible way. So if you're here to fall asleep, to zone out, or to drift into that half dreamy state where history becomes soft background noise, you're in the right place. Get comfortable, dim whatever lights are still trying too hard, let your pillow take over your responsibilities, and we'll just float into a quiet corner of the past together. No rush, no excitement, just calm, mildly interesting chaos from people who lived long ago and made questionable life choices, because that seems to be what royalty did best. The thing about history is that everyone talks about the big events, the wars, the discoveries, the revolutions. But honestly, those are the loud parts. The insomnia-friendly parts are the tiny, awkward human details nobody asked for, but somehow still exist in the record. The petty tantrums, the strange habits, the dynastic genetics that really should have come with warning labels. We're going to gently wander through all of that, like slow tourists who keep stopping because their shoes are uncomfortable. And I think a perfect place to start is the wonderfully strange world of royal lineage, where people somehow believed that marrying their cousin for the 17th time was an excellent strategy for honor. You can imagine how well that turned out. These families were obsessed with bloodlines, but the lines got so tangled that half of Europe was basically one extended group chat. Not a functional one, more like a chat where everyone has the same last name and nobody knows who's actually related anymore. Let's settle into one of the classics of royal dysfunction, because why not begin with someone whose face became a historical warning sign? A young man born into so much prestige, wealth, and divine ordained authority that he really should have been unstoppable. Except, of course, he wasn't, because his entire family tree looked like someone braided it into a pretzel. He entered the world already exhausted, probably tired from carrying centuries of questionable genetics on his tiny royal shoulders. His parents were, well, related. His grandparents were also related. His great-grandparents were related in ways that required diagrams and maybe a deep breath before trying to understand. And naturally, because this was tradition, he got the privilege of continuing this dynasty of questionable decisions. He grew up in a palace filled with people who spoke very softly, walked very carefully, and constantly reassured each other that everything was fine, even when it clearly wasn't. He was expected to rule one day, but ruling required energy, confidence, and the ability to sit upright without assistance. All things he had on some days, but not all. And whenever he was tired or unwell, which was often, the court doctors stepped in with their extremely helpful advice, like draining blood or applying herbs that probably smelled like disappointment. As he entered adulthood, it became obvious to everyone. So as we drift away from that very tired king and his very tired bloodline, let's quietly slide into another royal household that wasn't doing much better. Different palace, different tapestries, same general theme of everyone is related and nobody is thriving. It's comforting in a weird way how consistent royal families were at making the same mistakes generation after generation, as if someone wrote the answer key wrong and nobody ever questioned it. In this next kingdom, tucked somewhere between mountains, lakes, and a whole lot of political denial, there lived a prince whose entire personality seemed to be chronically overwhelmed. Not dramatically, of course, just in that subtle way where every day looks like he woke up 2 hours too early and hasn't recovered. He wasn't unhealthy as much as he was simply tired of existing, which is kinda relatable. But this was the royal court, so they liked to pretend that being exhausted was a sign of noble sensitivity.
He was the second son, which sounded less stressful until you realized it meant he had all the duties of looking royal and none of the authority. He spent most of his youth being shuffled between tutors who kept insisting he learn things he had absolutely no interest in. History, geography, diplomacy. He sat through it all with the same expression someone makes when politely listening to a very long explanation about taxes. Every now and then, a tutor would optimistically describe him as thoughtful, which was a polite way of saying he stared at the wall a lot. His mother, a queen who firmly believed in maintaining appearances at all costs, insisted that he attend every court event. Every single one. Balls, feasts, ceremonies celebrating obscure saints, ceremonies celebrating not-so-obscure saints, parades, diplomatic receptions, and something called the Midwinter Ribbon Procession, which sounded harmless but involved standing outside for hours watching nobles pretend they enjoyed seasonal wind. The prince would dress up, smile with the enthusiasm of a sleepy cat, and glide through events while trying not to fall asleep on decorative cushions. When he reached marriageable age, and of course he did, because royalty didn't get a choice, various families tried to arrange matches. His mother evaluated princesses the way someone might evaluate cloth at a market. Too quiet, too tall, too politically complicated, too smiley. The prince, meanwhile, sat quietly in the corner wondering if anyone would notice if he slipped out and found a quiet room to nap in. He didn't oppose marriage. He just didn't feel strongly about anything except occasionally getting some uninterrupted rest. Eventually, a suitable bride was found. She was polite, well-educated, and just enthusiastic enough to balance out his complete lack of energy. They met for the first time at a dinner that lasted 3 hours, because nobles believed conversations needed to be slow-cooked. She smiled warmly. He nodded gently. They talked about the weather for so long that it became its own diplomatic topic. By the end of the evening, the courtiers declared the meeting a success, mostly because nobody fainted or offended anyone. Their wedding was predictably grand. Lots of gold, lots of candles, lots of distant relatives pretending they knew the couple well. During the ceremony, the prince stood very still, probably concentrating on staying upright. His bride looked serene, perhaps imagining a future where her husband would occasionally express an emotion. But she had realistic expectations. Royal marriages were rarely romantic. They were more like quiet partnerships where each person did their best not to cause additional political paperwork. After their marriage, the prince settled into a repetitive, slow routine. Mornings involved meetings about things he didn't fully understand, but nodded politely at. Afternoons were for strolls around the palace garden.
And now that we've gently wandered away from our pleasantly exhausted prince and his very low-energy legacy, let's drift softly into yet another corner of royal history. Because, as always, there's no shortage of aristocratic families who manage to be both impressive and impressively uneventful at the same time. It's honestly comforting how predictable they were. You'd think after centuries of inbreeding and poorly planned marriages, they would learn something. But no, they stayed committed to their favorite family tradition, mild chaos wrapped in expensive clothing. In this next royal household, which sat in a region famous mostly for fog and overly formal etiquette, the main character was a princess who spent her entire life looking like she was halfway through a deep sigh. She wasn't dramatic about it. She wasn't even particularly unhappy. She just had that facial expression people get when they've been politely listening to boring conversations for too many years. Which, to be fair, she had. She grew up in a palace where silence was considered a sign of good breeding. Children weren't encouraged to run or laugh too loudly. They were expected to glide. Yes, glide. As if gravity was optional for the nobility. The princess did her best to follow the rules, but every now and then she would accidentally walk like a normal person and earn a gentle reminder that royal footsteps should be quiet, dear.
It didn't help that her governess had the emotional range of a damp tablecloth and taught her everything in a voice that could lull a squirrel into hibernation. Her days followed the royal formula: lessons, posture training, embroidery, more posture training, and the occasional carriage ride where she waved at townspeople who had no idea who she was. She became very good at waving. Not enthusiastic waving, of course, just that slow, graceful hand movement that says, "Yes, I am acknowledging your existence in the least physically demanding way possible." As she grew older, the royal family began assessing potential marriage candidates. This meant long afternoons listening to advisors describe various foreign princes who were somehow both unremarkable and politically useful. The descriptions were always something like, "He has a good jawline," or "He reads occasionally," or "His family owns 3 profitable salt mines." Salt was apparently very impressive back then. The princess would sit quietly, nodding as if salt futures were the height of romance. The suitors themselves were a mixed collection of mildly awkward young men who tried very hard to appear confident while sweating through their silk collars. One of them bragged about owning the largest horse stable in his kingdom. Another recited poetry he clearly didn't understand. A third tried to impress her by listing all the rare cheeses his family imported. She tried to seem interested, but it was difficult to react passionately about dairy, especially when narrated in monotone. Eventually, a match was chosen, not because they were soulmates or shared passions or even basic chemistry. No, they had the one thing royal families loved above all else: a treaty that needed signing. The prince she was set to marry was known for being polite but unexciting, which honestly was the best-case scenario for aristocratic men. He arrived with a modest entourage, a carefully trimmed beard, and a general aura of someone who desperately wanted everyone to think he was fine. Their engagement ceremony was precisely the level of underwhelming you'd expect. The princess stood beside him, looking serene. The prince smiled softly, the way someone does when they're not sure if they're being photographed. Court musicians played delicate background music that sounded identical to the music they played at every other event. People clapped with the gentle enthusiasm of someone tapping a table. Once married, the couple settled into a palace routine that felt less like a love story and more like an extended polite handshake. Breakfast together, separate activities for most of the day, dinner at the long table where conversations drifted like lukewarm tea. They were comfortable, though. Comfortable the way a pair of old slippers are comfortable. Not glamorous, not exciting, but reliable and not worth replacing. The prince was fascinated by clocks. Yes, clocks. Big clocks, small clocks, clocks with pointless decorative flourishes. He collected them the way some people collect regrets. Every week a new clock arrived, and as we drift away from the polite kingdom full of synchronized ticking and slightly confused royalty, we gently slide into another corner of European history, where things were, well, pretty much the same, just wrapped in different wallpaper. Because if there's one thing royal families excelled at, it was repeating the same mistakes while pretending each generation had invented the concept of dignity. This particular royal household lived in a palace so unnecessarily large that it had rooms nobody used and hallways nobody finished walking down. The walls were covered with portraits of ancestors who all looked vaguely disappointed, as if they had been forced to sit still for too long, which, to be fair, they were. In the middle of this quiet, echoing world lived a duke whose entire personality could be summarized as politely confused. The duke wasn't unintelligent. He was just the kind of man who took a few seconds longer than everyone else to process information. People would explain a political issue, and he'd nod very slowly, as if the explanation had taken a scenic route through his mind. His advisors learned to pause after every sentence so he could catch up, which made conversations sound like a group meditation session. He had inherited his title at a young age after his father, who was famously grumpy, decided to retire early, presumably because being annoyed full-time was exhausting. The Duke, on the other hand, found the job overwhelming, mostly because people expected him to make decisions before lunch. He much preferred to think about things, then think about thinking about things, and then quietly postpone any action until the problem solved itself. His mother, a dowager duchess who believed strongly in tradition, insisted that he marry as soon as possible. Not for love, of course. Love in royal families was treated like a decorative pillow. Nice if you had it, irrelevant if you didn't. Marriage was about alliances, and alliances were about preventing your neighbors from invading out of mild boredom. Potential brides were examined the way one might examine produce at a market. Good posture? Check. Family lineage? Acceptable. Ability to stand through long ceremonies without fainting? Ideal. Eventually, they found a princess who met all the criteria and, most importantly, looked patient enough to handle a husband who paused mid-sentence because he forgot what words were. She arrived for the formal introduction wearing a dress so wide that she needed 2 ladies-in-waiting just to help her turn around. The Duke bowed awkwardly. She curtsied gracefully. They exchanged polite greetings with all the emotional intensity of 2 distant cousins discussing weather patterns. It was perfectly, beautifully dull. Their marriage proceeded without incident. This was considered a triumph in aristocratic circles, where weddings could sometimes cause political melodrama or minor uprisings. But this couple? No scandals, no tension, just 2 mildly tired. Drifting away from the quietly competent Duke and his bird-watching pursuits, let's float into another palace, slightly farther north, where the halls were drafty and the chandeliers slightly tilted, as if gravity itself was politely declining to be involved in court life. The inhabitants of this palace were remarkably consistent in their priorities: look majestic, breathe carefully, and avoid exertion unless absolutely necessary. Their lives moved with the steady rhythm of candlelight flickering against gilded walls, which, in hindsight, made them perfect candidates for our sleepy journey. The central figure here was a king who had inherited the throne at a remarkably young age, mostly because the previous generation had insisted on dying in a timely, procedural manner. He was tall enough to appear imposing in portraits, but had the energy level of someone who had just woken up from a nap and hadn't yet adjusted to the responsibilities of standing. Courtiers quickly learned that asking him to make decisions quickly was a waste of time. Instead, they provided extensive, step-by-step written explanations that he would read in long, measured bursts while slowly nodding along. It was a perfect system for inducing sleep, not only in the king, but in anyone listening to the reports. He spent much of his youth being guided by tutors and advisors, all of whom were dedicated to ensuring that he looked regal, even when internally wishing he could hide under the nearest heavy curtain. He studied languages, history, etiquette, and the art of sitting still without appearing bored. He excelled at sitting still. He also excelled at appearing vaguely interested while mentally composing lists of chairs he might like better. Ambassadors visiting from other countries often misread his quiet demeanor as wisdom or deep thought. It was actually just extreme patience and a talent for zoning out in public. When it came time to marry, as it inevitably did, the king was matched with a princess whose main attributes were patience and composure, which were highly desirable qualities for surviving court life.
The engagement itself was deliberately prolonged, mostly because the king's advisors feared that rushing the ceremony might trigger sudden excitement, which could lead to fatigue. The wedding was grand, but not overwhelming. The music was soft, the speeches polite, and the cake served in slices just large enough to be satisfying without causing indigestion. Their married life followed a predictable, gently lulling rhythm. The king attended meetings, signed documents, and occasionally rode in carriages, all with remarkable care not to exert himself unnecessarily. The queen oversaw domestic matters, managed correspondence, and occasionally reminded him to eat something that was not solely composed of bread and boiled vegetables. They both found a quiet contentment in the absence of drama. Courtiers often commented that it was refreshing to have a monarchy that didn't erupt into scandal every season, though this was mostly an observation rather than a carefully considered opinion. The king developed a mild hobby of cataloging minor occurrences in the court: when a particular lamp flickered, when a dog barked, when a window didn't close properly in winter. He recorded these observations with gentle precision, though no one could ever find a practical purpose for them. The queen, conversely, enjoyed embroidery and botanical illustrations, creating patterns so